welcome to Callis Prep's SAT reading course. My name's Evan, and today we're going to be looking at how to define these words in context questions. So, since this is our first SAT reading course, before we get started on the words in context questions, I want to go over the structure of this course a little bit so that you know how these lectures are going to work for the future. So each of the lectures is going to cover one or two question types. This one's going to cover the word in context question type, which is basically the vocabulary questions of the SAT reading test. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to cover each of these question types, again, words in context in this case, in the context of a humanities, social science, and a science passage. The reason for this is those are the three basic passage types that you'll see on the SAT. Some of these appear as passage pairs, but the fundamental concepts behind them remain the same. So what we'll do is we'll look at each question type in the context of each passage type so that we can see how each question type is used differently from passage to passage. From there, we'll develop strategies and tips and techniques for solving each question type with each passage type, and we'll notice the similarities between all these passages as we go on. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and look at the first passage today. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to take a minute here. I'll let you guys pause the video, review the passage you see here, or the short excerpt. Once you've read that, go ahead, press play, and we'll talk about the question and how we go about solving it. So go ahead, pause your video now, and press play when you're ready to resume. Okay, now that you've taken a minute to review this question, or this passage, let's go ahead and look at the question here. Now, this is a really standard format for what you expect to see for a words in context question. Almost all of them are going to say, as used in line, whatever line, this word most nearly means, and then it'll give you four choices. So what we have to do here is we have to look at how the word is being used in the passage. And what the SAT is really good at doing now is they give you hints. Every passage is going to use words that have a lot of sort of contextual meaning. They're not necessarily the most difficult vocabulary words, but they are kind of words that have multiple meanings that can be used differently for different contexts. Those are the ones you can expect to see in the words in context questions. And so I tried to choose some words that have maybe multiple meanings or rather difficult meanings, but can be determined based on the context of the passage. Now our word here is in line 3, and it's incredulity. Now, incredulity might be an unfamiliar word. It's not used very often in English writing, but we can use the context of the passage in order to determine what incredulity might mean. So what we want to do here is figure out what is the relationship between the ideas here, and we can figure that out right away from this first phrase, or rather this first clause. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. And here we know the theme is contrast. Charles Dickens is setting up a number of contrasts, the best and the worst, the wisdom and the foolishness, the belief and the incredulity. So now we know what we're looking for. We know that incredulity, based on what we know of the passage, is going to mean the opposite of belief. Just like the best and the worst are opposites, belief and incredulity must also be the same way. Now with that in mind, we know what we want for our answer here. We want something that means non-belief or disbelief. And the word that's closest here is going to be choice C, skepticism. Skepticism meaning simply disbelief. Now our other choices are not only not quite good enough definitions for incredulity, but they also don't contrast with belief. Apathy is simply not caring, so it's not really the opposite of belief, it's kind of simply a lack of belief. Nonchalance is simply a kind of careless or easygoing attitude, again not good enough for an opposite of belief. And acceptance, well, that's a form of belief, so that we know is a synonym and not what we're looking for. So this is a really good short example of how you can use context to determine the meaning of words. What you want to do is look at the surrounding text and figure out what relationships are there, and then you can extrapolate on those relationships to find the definition of the word, even if it's a word you've never really seen before. So now let's move on to our next short passage here. We've got a short social science passage. Same drill. Go ahead, look at who wrote this, kind of read the intro information, read the passage, and then we'll talk about this vocab word together and decide how it's being used in the context of the passage. So go ahead, pause now and press play when you're ready to continue. All right. Now that we've had a minute for this one as well, let's jump right into the word in context that we're looking at here, which, as used in line 8, in the light of most nearly means. Good, so we see here this is not a word in context, but a phrase in context. Now you'll also see that on the SAT. It's not always going to be a single vocab word or some random word that you've never seen before. Sometimes it'll be a fairly common phrase being used in an unusual way, or an outdated or older phrase being used in a common way for the era, but no longer common. And that's what we have here. This was written in 1922. So we know that a lot of the language being used by Henry Ford here might be a little archaic or unusual. So what we want to do is figure out what we could replace in the light of based on what's going on in the sentence, which reads, just from the last part of it, is an excellent time to suggest something of the things that may be done in the light of what has been done. So what he's talking about here, and by looking at the larger passage, we know that he's talking about it's time for us to kind of look at the past to see what has been done in order to see what we can do in the future. So what he's asking us to do is consider the past when looking toward the future. And that's kind of a common theme throughout this paragraph that we have here. He's saying, we're at a tipping point in humanity. We're going towards an industrial society, and we need to go into that industrial society considering what we've done in the past, or looking back at what we've done in the past. So for that reason, we're going to go with choice D here. In the light of literally does mean considering. The other answer choices aren't nearly as accurate. Revealing, demonstrating, and disregarding, not only do they not really fit into the context of the sentence, but they're not really acceptable definitions of the idiom in the light of. Revealing kind of does match with light, but as they're used, it just doesn't quite line up. So in these cases, and especially with these phrases or idioms, the obvious answer is not always going to be the right one. You have to, again, use that context of the sentence and the passage as a whole. So let's move on to our final example for the words in context and look at a very short science passage and see what they want us to work with here. Go ahead, pause the video, and press play when you're ready to look at the question. All right. Hopefully we've had enough time to review this one as well. So in this passage, which is discussing the discovery of Pluto, though I know they never mention Pluto, I'll let you know that that's what it's about. The word we're looking for here is in line 3, and it's arcane. So this is another fairly unusual word. It's not really one we use in our daily speak, but it appears often in academic writing. And all of the definitions we have for arcane are actually accurate definitions. It's kind of a word that can mean many things. All of them are kind of centered around this idea of mystery or special knowledge or something like that. So here we have the sentence, or the context for this word is, he was staring into an arcane device called a blink comparator. I've never even heard of that one, which allowed him to rapidly switch from viewing one image to the next. Good, so it's arcane, we can figure, because, well, like I said, I've never heard of a blink comparator. I can hardly even pronounce it. So we know that this is kind of a sign that it's kind of this older, not used, and very specific device. So we're looking for a word that means specific. We can get rid of mysterious because although that's a definition for arcane, we know that this device isn't mysterious because right after naming the device, the author tells you what it does. No mystery there. Esoteric. Well, that's a weird word. Very few students I would expect know what that means. If you do, good on you. If you don't, I completely understand. We can't even guess at what that means because it looks strange. We'll move on to the next one, opaque. A much more common word meaning unable to be seen through, so not transparent in other words. And that's pretty literal. It means you literally cannot see. So if a pane of glass is said to be opaque, it means it's dark. You can't see through it. That doesn't really fit because, again, the definition of this blink comparator is that you look at one image rapidly going back and forth one to another. It's not opaque, it's transparent because you're looking at images. So we know opaque is no good, and we can also say secret's no good for the same reason as mysterious. It's not a secret device because the author tells us exactly what it does right after he mentions it. So we're left only with esoteric. And this is giving us a good excuse to use our process of elimination method. And that's one of the most important methods for any section of the SAT. Using the process of elimination is going to help you narrow down your choices, and even if you can get rid of 2 choices by process of elimination, you're down to 2 choices left, which means you have a 50% chance of getting it right if you just guess at random, which is pretty good. So we're going to use the process of elimination a lot on the reading test, and that's exactly what we've done here. We know the answer has to be B, even though we might not know what B, or esoteric, means. Now, for your own gratification and for future use, esoteric means belonging to a very specific set of knowledge. So, in other words, I suppose knowing how to perform a triple bypass is esoteric. Only a surgeon or a doctor is expected to be able to know how to do that. Therefore, it belongs to a very specific set of knowledge. And that fits for what we have in the passage here. A blink comparator, I really hope that's how you pronounce it, is meant to be used by a very specific set of people, in this case, probably astrophysicists. So we can feel confident that esoteric is the correct answer, and in fact it is. So now we've seen today 3 different ways that words in context questions might occur in passages, in the context of a humanities, a social science, and a science passage. Each word used was very unique. Each one kind of fit the theme of the passage. Arcane is a more science-y word, whereas something like incredulity is something you're very likely to see in a literature passage, especially Dickens, like we did today. So in the future, we're going to keep doing this, looking at how question types differ from passage to passage, because doing so will help us form different strategies for solving them. So that's all we're going to cover for today, but I hope to see you next time at Callis Prep's SAT Reading course.